we did a concert once, but afterwards.
Do is take about 5 minutes talking amongst yourself about the first two questions. So the first is mere Christianity is, this is the second one up here, right? Yeah. First is mere Christianity is filled with poignant phrases. One of the most famous is found in this chapter: aim at heaven and you will get earth thrown in, aim at earth and you will get neither. Explain what that means. And then the second is, in our culture, why is it difficult for us to have Christian hope of heaven? And how is the desire for heaven gives us a good reason to hope that heaven actually exists? So what I'm proposing, and then the third is more like a personal, almost like a faith sharing sort of question, right? Are you more inclined to the fool's way, the disillusioned way, or the Christian way of thinking about heaven? So what I'd like you to do is take the first two questions right now. I'll give you maybe 7 minutes to talk amongst yourselves. I actually think it worked better when we had you write up on the flip charts. And so I'll ask you to pick a facilitator or write up on the flip charts. Then we'll come back and do our whole thing together. And then about 10 till, I'll have you just at your own tables talk about the third question. So those, I think, are questions you might rather talk about in a smaller group rather than a larger group, or at least I would, speaking for myself, perhaps. So, okay, does that make sense? How are we going to do that? So the first thing to do is tackle those first two questions amongst yourself, 5-7 minutes, and put some words to paper. Maybe 1 more minute, so chance to write something up there if you haven't already. Let's wait for them to finish. And then... Do you want me to?
Yep. I guess that means you guys are starting.
Am I being recorded right now?
Yes.
It's Barry Loftus. It is April 2nd, and I'm being recorded with my consent. I'm ready to go.
ADN is a one-party recording system, right?
It is, but you know, when people do that, it causes all nothing but trouble.
Yeah. But you have another department.
Don't ever do that with New York.
Trouble.
Back when I was in New York, it was not trouble.
Are you from New York?
No, what we're talking about is.
All right. Let's start to come back together. And you can keep writing if you're still putting stuff up, but otherwise I think we'll start going around the room, Gem, and see what we got for answers. So we'll start with this table here.
Okay. All right. So we were focusing, our conversation talked about the right thing to do is to put yourself on God's hand, in God's hands now, help others do good things, and you will realize heaven on earth. And we talked about the artificial distinction that humans have come up with, separating the concept of heaven and our existence here, completely human made, and that that we were not trained, we haven't been trained, as Lewis says, to understand that. We're trained to just focus on material things on earth. And the flip side of that is exclusive focus on earth is empty and unsatisfying and leads to nothingness.
Yeah, I think this gets at a lot of the really interesting stuff. So Lewis has got a really sophisticated view here. And this comes out in the three mistakes or the three ways, right? It's one of the mistakes is thinking this life and its pleasures are all that there is. But the other mistake is thinking heaven's got nothing to do with what we're doing here. And that our desires for worldly things are nothing like the desires for the things that we want in heaven, right? Both of those are mistakes, Lewis thinks, right? And both are going to make you really unhappy, and both are going to deny you the ability to really desire heaven, right? If you only desire things in this world, then it's sort of obvious why it's going to be hard for you to desire heaven. But if you think heaven's got nothing to do with the desires of this world, then it's hard to know what you're desiring if you're desiring it. Well, what's going to happen there? What am I going to like there? Right? Why do I really want it? But if you don't really want it, if you don't really desire it, that's a whole huge part of the Christian life that's missing from the faith that you say that you have. Right? From the way that you have these beliefs, but you can't actually make them active in some way that you're actually orienting yourself. Right? Okay, let's move on to this table over here.
We sort of struggled mightily with this.
Okay.
And didn't really come up with things. So I'm going to throw this out. I
Struggles are good.
didn't get it out, or it didn't occur to me. But I think we're missing a part of this that was sort of the flip side of what he said in one of the morning ones, where we're always pounding down these bad influences and the reason that we fight against doing the right thing. And there's a flip side of that at some point we read about, where we should strive to better ourselves to help offset and help us pound down the bad influences. But I don't see where Lewis makes the connection that the reason we should be trying to better ourselves is partly for betterment of the world. He talked about the great people in the Middle Ages and so forth that saw that more clearly. And so, but the ultimate reason then is the ultimate goal in heaven. And Lewis admits that since the Middle Ages, we've lost that vision. So how true that is, I'm not willing to totally accept. I mean, we're still talking about it, so we haven't totally lost it. I don't know. It's a jumble.
Yeah.
It's up to me.
I'm not a historian, so I won't try and weigh on the historical question of whether we've lost it or not. Right? Yeah, I'm not sure about that. But the first struggle and the confusion, I think maybe I can kind of help with, right? Because I think it's related to these two things that we're supposed to avoid. And it's kind of related to what Lewis says about our natural instincts as compared to our conscience, right? So I should be clear. So Lewis doesn't have the view that some people in philosophical ethics have had, that what you need to do is suppress your instincts and act on the basis of your reason, for example, right? Lewis has a far more humane vision than that. He thinks our natural instincts are good. They're there for good reason, and they were given to us by God. But as he says, you set any single one of them up as your guide, and that's when you're going to go astray. It's your conscience that has to guide you in how you satisfy and pursue and order all of these natural instincts, right? Which is a sophisticated view. It's in the history of philosophy, it's an older view, often associated with Aristotle, right? Taken up from there into Aquinas, and from there into Christian ethics more broadly as a kind of virtue of the wholeness of the human being, right? A kind of harmony of our animal nature and our spiritual nature and so on. So I would say there's something similar that's going on in the relationship between earth and heaven, right? The two mistakes, if you want to put it that way, are to think there's no heaven, and all we can do is make this earth the best earth it can be, right? Or to think, the heck with earth, we're going to leave that behind. Like, all we should be doing is to be focused on heaven. Because in fact, Lewis thinks the best version of earth is the version of earth that's pointed at heaven. It's aiming in that direction. But to get that, you need a goal, you need heaven. But you need earth too. You can't just abandon earth. You've got to try and push earth in that direction. So in the same way that at the individual level, we can't try and abandon our natural instincts, right? What we need to do is orient them and focus them in the right sort of direction, right? What we need to do is orient our action on this earth and making the earth a better place. But what that's supposed to mean is the kind of place that points at heaven. Right? Even if heaven remains far off, and we shouldn't confuse heaven for earth, right? We need both terms of the relation, if you like it in more abstract terms. You got to have earth and heaven if you're going to point earth at heaven. I don't know if that helps with the confusion, but that's what I would say. Do you want to follow up or move on? Thank you.
Well, I'm the thing that I am sort of surprised that Lewis doesn't talk about is that, and I guess I can sort of see why, is a rough, and he sort of does in a way, because I noticed that there have been biblical citations on some of those doodlings. And so at this point, are we to sort of think of, or does Lewis think of the vision of heaven as back to the original situation where we first see us in the Garden of Eden with God? Is that an equivalence that holds some water?
He's not trying to provide any detailed things.
That's right.
But here's where that is going in the right direction. He thinks that desires that we have on earth are desires for the things of heaven. And so there's got to be something about heaven that is relatively similar to earth, where the desires that we have on earth that we find unsatisfied are satisfied. Right? But I think that's about all he's going to give you, right? But
Yeah,
that's what his intermediate position requires. So it can't be that what we're going to get in heaven is the satisfaction of some desire that we don't even feel right now, right? Or some desire for something that's totally different from anything that we desire right now. But it's going to be satisfied in a different way and in a different object, right? So we're supposed to be able, right, to use the example of our spouse, we're supposed to love our imperfect spouses, right? Because the promise of heaven and the relationship that we will have there, right, shines through that. I mean, that's the sort of the vision that's supposed to come true.
Let me clarify something. The scriptural references aren't Lewis's, are they? They are the Doodles.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, because the book is totally devoid of,
Yeah.
it would seem, yeah.
And Lewis wanted it that way. Remember, being like pushed out to people on army goals.
Yeah.
We're not looking up references. All right, we go to this table here. What do we got back?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So we had a lot of discussion, really good discussion. One of the big things that we came away with was the idea of that earthly things, when you want earthly things and you concentrate on those, like you're so focused on your health that you turn into a hypochondriac. But you're trying to fill a hole or some kind of a want that you have. And where is that coming from? Well, it's like it's coming from heaven. So if you then think about heaven, then you can have all of those wants or fill that hole that you have on earth because you're going through with actions while you're here on earth. So you're doing good things, you're helping others, you're satisfying your spiritual side, all of that while you're aiming at heaven, but you're also satisfying at the same time your earthly desires.
Yeah, it's very nicely put, right? And it's like I said, it's a sophisticated position, right? I mean, I remember the doodles where you had the people with like the arrows. I think part of Lewis's view is if you thought the desire for heaven was somehow completely different from our earthly desires, you'd have no compass point. You have no idea whether that's heading. You'd have no compass point. You have no idea whether that's heading or not. You know what it's like when you're desiring your spouse in a better way. Right? And even if it's still satisfying ways, right? It's pointing you in the right direction. Right? So there's this sense that we're getting what do you call it, a kind of moral feedback through our desires. And again, the mistake to avoid is either thinking our earthly desires are irrelevant or thinking that they're the only. Right? And finding that way to put the right kind of weight on them so you can get the feedback that you need, right? And allow conscience to actually work on you without, falling into the trap of thinking this is all it is. And that's part of the attempt. Yeah.
I think at some point, Louis said something like St. Augustine said, you have created us, O Lord, and our hearts are rested until they rest in you. And Louis said something similar to that. Remember what he said?
No, but it is something like that. That's quite right. Right. Yeah. We're restless. Right? We can see what's there. Right? This is a part of what Lewis says. He evokes this sort of principle that we wouldn't have the desire if the object wasn't there. Right? And these objects are sort of like that. And so they sort of give us a sense of what satisfaction is like, but it's not complete. So we're restless in this way. But that points in the right direction, right? If we can look that far. Great. Let's go to this table here.
Well, our intergenerational group is very interesting. And we had such a wonderful discussion. So I will answer number 2 as a group, and then number 1 occurred to me while I was trying to remember what I was supposed to say.
Okay.
So anyway, we were talking about hope, and I was telling them that the Beatitude, blessed are the poor in spirit, is also true materially. Blessed are the poor materially. Because me, coming from the third world, hope is very much alive. When you cannot have anything, even food and water, your direction is towards something supernatural. But you can get it. So you pray and you get it for today, and your attitude is different. In the United States, it's a different matter altogether, and you know that already. The question to number 1, I wanted to ask, and with the permission of my group, I would like to cite an example that I thought of. For example, given 2 medical doctors, same caliber, they are same operating group. One is a Catholic, and he's not only a Catholic, every time he does his work, he thinks of God. The other one is in medicine because he wants to make money. So he's after the glamour. So now they are the same case, which is unusual, but they're the same case, both difficult. The doctor who is now coming like like what Louis said, over the rim where he is now, where the rubber meets the road, right? There's a difficulty. He's very good, but he thinks God is beside him and all that. I mean, he's very trained, and yet there is this supernatural pocket where it just comes from God. This other one cannot go there. Now he starts calling human beings. But they make the same money, but the result on the patient is different. So this is the example that came, but I was trying to remember what they're asking me to say. You know, so those are the examples.
Yeah. Yeah, let me just speak to the first point. I think Father Tom has preached on this a number of times since he's come here, right? One of the things that one of the ways that I think in wealthy societies we get tricked, right, is whatever you have, there's something a little better. It's almost within your means, right? And you think that's what I need. Right, I've got my little 300cc motorcycle out there, which is tons of fun. And I think, well, if I had a 500cc motorcycle, I can get that. Well, you know, I spend an afternoon watching video review motorcycles.
But it's easy to do all of that and forget motorcycles are fun.
Right, and you could just go out for a ride instead of spending an afternoon watching YouTube videos. Right, but it's easy when there's always sort of one more thing on that rung to think that's the next spot, right, that you can do, rather than seeing there's something that's we're infinitely far away, that's infinitely better, and in a way not the same kind of thing.
Great, all right, let's move on to this table, I think, given time.
Answer the question. It's easier to tolerate frustrations now. Responsibility that can be resolved. One of the things we had. The question is, in her, and perhaps I get both. And one of the things I thought of was that there's a verse, Matthew 8:36, I think, that says, you know, what good is it to gain the whole world but lose your soul? And so I think that's what you get. If you aim for earth, you might get it, but so what? You know, there's the perspective of earth, and then the other thing we wrote is there's the eternal perspective. Putting your eyes on heaven, puts everything in the fact that you live here for 70, 80 years, whatever God gives us, and, well, you know, that's it. So I think one of the things I remember is like, you know, there's never seen a hearse pulling a U-Haul. You know? So let's see, what else did I forget to tell us? I guess kind of it, you know, and then what table 1, 2, 3, 4 said that.
Right. So I think the idea of perspective here is a good one to invoke, right? The right thing to do is to keep earth and our earthly desires in the right perspective, not to try and put them out of view, right? But not to have them so close that you can't see that with which they contrast, right? And then you can put the right kind of value and have the right kind of expectations, right? You know, ever since I became an academic administrator, I say to myself every day, the perfect is the enemy of the good, right? And most of what you need is something good enough. And if you can keep that conflict between your colleagues from boiling over, maybe next month it'll be better, right? And you just try and mitigate and ameliorate and so on. And it turns out you can do a lot of good that way in a lot of contexts. If you keep it in perspective and have the right kinds of expectations, right? Then you get the satisfaction back in earth, right? but only because you've got the eternal perspective on this. All right, let's move on to this thing over here. We have the.
I guess I'll be the spokesperson for our group. I think we struggled with this a little bit. I think it was a challenge. One of the things that we concluded about what we had read was that on earth, no one is happy unless what they desire is beyond themselves. That the idea of kingship, which has come to us through history, this idea that there is one entity which is self-satisfied, that exists above all creation and is able to satisfy all that person's desires or wishes, the Midas of the world, that ultimately that's a vain illusion, and that no such person has ever or could ever exist, and that it is fundamental to the human nature to have desires which are beyond our grasp. The other question that we talked about a little bit was simply, what is it that you think about when you think about heaven? And that's a very hard question for most people who really think about it. And I think it's a very personal question in many ways. So I don't know, we could talk about that a little more. But the last thing that was raised is that whatever this thing is, or this life that we think is beyond ourselves, that we have been given hope of, that we also believe that what we share with each other, especially in the Mass, is a taste. It is a bit of preparation for whatever heaven is. So that's just one way to connect what we're doing here with each other and what we do with each other upstairs with the philosophy that we've been talking about.
Yeah, and one thing I'll add to this is, I think Lewis thinks there's a real danger of not seeing what we do here as a taste of heaven, right? Which is, heaven becomes this sort of empty notion. And then it just can't really motivate us in the right way. You can't aim at an empty goal, right? The goal's got to have some content to it. It's got to be determinate in some way. And if you don't have some experiences where you think it's going to be kind of like that, even if it'll be much better or be different in some way, if you don't have something to suggest that, it's going to be really hard to get the fullness of the Christian life, because what are you hoping for? Right? What's the actual content of that hope? I mean, and I got to say, for me, this is the one that I struggle with most, right? Every time I'm saying the rosary and I come to this first initial 3 Hail Marys, and I think hope. Like, on the one hand, I really want it. Why am I praying for it? What am I hoping for? And Lewis's argument here is, unless you hold these two things together, heaven and earth, you're going to lose that, right? And you're going to lose that Christian orientation. All right, let's go into this table.
Well, I think we mostly got, our discussion went into the aspects of culture. And this top one here, fear of death equal no heaven vision. And that kind of, I think, sums up our culture now around this loss of vision of heaven, maybe. And we were talking about healthcare also, and we have lots of improvements in healthcare. And what really the healthcare does is allows our ego to wrap itself around death. I believe it kind of has conquered it, even though in reality it hasn't. But yeah, and then we kind of looked at consumerism, materialism. The focus kind of in the wrong area. The wrong, the doctor who's in service to his ego rather than service of something bigger. example that was earlier.
That's right. Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, it seems like there's something we could do about that, right?
Yeah. And we have.
It's medical care, right? Even if it's only just staved off, right? Yeah, that's right. And then that gives us a different sense of how we feel towards what comes after that, right? And maybe once we start believing that we have a power over death, it's hard in a different way to hope for something beyond that, right? It's hard to put ourselves in God's hands.
Now, it's a chicken and egg here. We don't know, okay, so is there a loss of view of heaven, right? Which means I have nowhere else to go and I'm afraid of dying, right? Versus my mom, who's 100, it's like, she's ready to go and death is just kind of the next step, right? But, yeah.
But that also feeds into consumerism, materialism, is because if this is, I have no vision and this is it, I better get as much stuff as I can.
Yeah, that's right.
Or the next big motorcycle or TV or car or whatever it is.
And the more you can get that stuff, the easier it is to move that. Right, let's go back to the earlier. All right, Nick, let's do one last, the last table.
Okay, we mainly focused on the first question. We all kind of shared what we had there. But along with it, we brought up some discussion about people who have aimed at Earth. And I believe it was Father Sama, or maybe it was Father Patrick, in one of their homilies that talked about how in the 20th century, there were some optimists who wanted to develop a utopia on Earth. But when you look at the evidence of their actions, the millions of people who died in that quest were clear evidence that they were aiming definitely at the wrong target. But kind of in our discussion, we ended with want to end with a summary that Chris gave us. A lot of the things here on Earth have a very limited time of joy. And the quote he said was, if you want to be happy for a day, get drunk. If you want to be happy for a week, get a new job. If you want to be happy for a month, get a new wife. But if you want to be happy for a long time, you got to look at something higher. So,
Yeah, something that stays in front of you. Yeah, something that's still around. Yep. Sure.
Lewis was not Catholic, but we as Catholics had the Eucharist. And if we really believe in the Eucharist and it makes us sons of God, then we have perhaps an inside track, if you will, towards focusing on heaven, relating the earth to heaven.
Yeah, a taste of heaven, right?
Heaven on Earth.
So I'm not Catholic, I'm Anglican, like Mr. Lewis. I hate to think, I'm not going to say, but I do want to mention one thing about, in our group discussion, a few of us thought about the kind of turn this around, the heaven and earth business. And my focus is doing good on earth, and I think heaven will come along if I do. I have a hard time focusing on heaven. I'm more day to day, and I find it enough challenge in doing good on earth.
Yep, right.
Yeah.
I think that's what Chris was saying earlier is we need to point our earth towards that objective. I think that's what you do. I know what you do. And I think what Lewis was saying is if we're not even looking towards heaven, he said, I'm focused on earth and heaven will come. We're not even focused or aware that heaven is there or believe that that's a possibility. And why are we trying to make earth that I should be in it for myself and
If you work on always trying to be better, bettering yourself, bettering the world, if that's not aiming toward heaven, I'm not sure what it is.
But does there always have to be a motive? I mean, can you just do good because you do good?
Right.
Do you do it because I'm thinking, oh, wow, this will get me in heaven, one more.
Oh, wait till we get to the forgiveness stuff. That's not the motive. That's not the motive that Lewis thinks that you ought to have. Right? Lewis thinks you ought to be aiming at a good that you understand in this world that you think will be ultimately realized. Right? But there's no buying your way into heaven. All right. So we've got a little bit more time. So why don't you take just about 5 minutes and talk amongst yourselves if you're comfortable about number 3, right? This actually comes very nicely out of this last little discussion we were having here. This is a sort of know yourself moment, right? Which are you more inclined to? Which mistake on Lewis's view, right? Focusing exclusively on earth or focusing exclusively on heaven, right? The Aristotle always said when you're doing virtue ethics, you should Aristotle thought the virtue was the mean between 2 extremes. And Aristotle thought you ought to know yourself well enough to know which of the 2 extremes you're most tempted to and overcorrect in the other direction, right? That's a key part to the moral life. So in a way, Lewis is asking you, which of the extremes are you more likely to do? To focus exclusively on earth, to abandon earth, to heaven? So where do you need to sort of overcorrect or course correct? So take about 5 minutes to talk about that, and then we'll take a break and come back at 2:15. I think it's been working pretty well to take the questions together. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's take a look at the first 3 questions. So the first is, how is faith like love a feeling to be learned? Second is, why is it foolish to think about faith as a bargain with God? And the third question is, when you find your faith is weak, what can you do to strengthen it? So tackle all or any of those that you feel like. I don't know, maybe 8 minutes. And then try and write some things up there. I think that worked pretty well to give us some determinant. All right, go to it. Yes, thank you.
Right, church, prayer, study, church, reading, yes. They separated theology and church. That's accurate. Yes. Churches and apologetics. Well, I try to talk about the different pillars. If you want around, you got to have scripture, catechism, apologetics, theology, sacraments. What is that, 5 pillars? I can't have one with each.
Now I wish I had.
Apologize, scripturalized theology, apologize. And I missed one. What was the question again?
Virtue of faith, how is faith like love, a feeling to be learned? Why is it foolish to think about faith as a bargain with God? And we talked about how it was a bargain. We don't have anything to bargain with.
Something up. So let's go ahead and get started. We'll start with you here.
All right. So on the first question, we went ahead and we talked about how faith is like love. And we said it's step by step, and you have to keep that in front of you, where you've got to go to church, study, reading, and pray as a way to make those steps. Then we talked about why it's foolish to think of faith as bargaining with God. God has all the chips. You're not bargaining with someone that has all the chips. When your faith is weak, what should you do? Daily prayer, study, silent worship as ways to keep that closeness. And then how is reading Mere Christianity so far strengthen your faith? Didn't really get to that one a whole lot, but I know for myself, it comes back to the reading, right? It's one thing to come to Mass every week. You sit in there, we listen to the priest, but by reading something like this, discussing it, it definitely makes you think more and make you realize how to get closer to God.
Yeah. So all of this stuff is really helpful, right? It's maybe to start with the analogy with love. It's not you have it or you don't, right? There's qualities to it. You can advance in it, and it's something that if not nurtured will die, right? So part of the sort of overall kind of humane view that Lewis has of the human person is a sense of just how forgetful we are, just how frequently we say we believe things and it doesn't really show up in what we do, right? Or doesn't even show up in the next thing that we say right after we said we believe those sorts of things. Right, so it's really important for Lewis that faith is not the first step, not even in this first sense of faith that we're going to talk about for this chapter. The second sense of faith we're going to talk about in the next chapter, right? It's not what you do first, like the sort of leap, as it were, right? And then you try and practice the Christian life. No, you come to believe, and then faith is the hard work of continuing to believe. And to believe better and to believe more deeply. Right? And all of this is supposed to resolve this kind of conceptual puzzle that he has of how can it be a virtue? Right? And maybe another way to step back, right? When philosophers at least usually talk about virtue and virtue ethics, what they mean by that is a view about ethics that focuses less on individual decisions or on the kind of principles that you have, than on the long-term formation of your character, right? So Aristotle, who's probably the paradigmatic virtue theorist in the history of Western philosophy, honestly entertained the question, can you really say that somebody's happy or virtuous before they die, right? Can you even say it after they die because they think, oh, well, they might be shamed by their kids and so on? Right? And that's a question that doesn't even make any sense if you think virtue or morality is about an individual decision or about the kind of principles that you have, right? But instead, if you're talking about virtues, you're talking about something, right, that is supposed to cut deeper and deeper, right, to be more and more obvious a form of your character in your life. And so to talk about faith as a virtue is in a way trying to talk about having these beliefs that we have impress themselves on us deeper and deeper. Okay, great. Let's go on to this table. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
All right. The first sentence, well, the big thing that changed my view of faith here, its definition, is the word return. And that's what Lewis is asking us about faith, this return to this basis. And I wrote down the word practice, but a better word that came up to mind was really keeping mindfulness about faith. And then can you talk about offering?
Oh, that's
Where you want?
talking about how people have, we talk about faith and how that when something comes up that kind of challenges your faith, something happens, and then you offer it up or you recognize it's just something that God. But then we were talking about Mother Teresa and feeling faith because she never felt. I mean, after the end of her life, never felt.
Yeah. I mean, she's a really interesting case, right? Tested very deeply. There's a right. I mean, practice and return. Are the two things that I'll pick up here, right? Particularly, there's return in the kind of I don't know what you want to call it, theoretical or cognitive case, reminding yourself that you believe these things, right? So part of the practice is saying the prayer, saying the creed, listening to the Bible, reading the Bible, reminding yourself of what the actual content of your belief is, because that can sometimes, float away. I don't know if any of you know this phrase. The Pew Charitable Trust does these religion surveys every year about what they think religious people actually believe. And what they will tell you that most Christians actually believe is what they call moralized therapeutic deism. Right? They believe in some watchmaker God who turned the world loose, who gave us some moral principles, and if we follow those, it'll be therapeutic for us and we'll be happier, right? That's pretty clearly not the God of the Gospels, not the God of the Bible, and so on, but they think in doing all of these surveys year after year that that's what most Christians actually do believe. If you look at what they say they believe and the way that they act, right? To return to the actual content of the faith is to remind yourself what you actually believe, what you believe about heaven, what you believe about the Trinity, and so on. Right? And then, of course, there's the practical return, right? The kind of thing that the prophets are always calling us back to, having sort of fallen away. And particularly, the temptation to fall away when you don't feel that closeness to God, right, is strong. And so this, I'll more or less put that off until the next chapter, because the second sense of faith is supposed to kick in once you've fallen away a number of times and you realize, oh, wait a minute, this is going to keep happening, right? What do I do and how do I put my faith in God? Okay, let's move on to this. If you don't mind moving the. That's right. It is.
We broke ours down into pieces, and the one goes back to practice. We're talking about when you join the church, when you've finally accepted the faith, you've joined, and in that 6 weeks, someone mentioned the 6 weeks, I think maybe in his text, that's crucial, but also beyond. And I think I always worry about those people that go through RCIA, that we really integrate them and help them and support them to do that, because otherwise you can easily fall away. The other thing that kind of ties together is seeing those people who are successful in faith and using them as examples as well. And so we also mentioned at the top here, which I just thought was kind of funny, that we, all of you and myself and people we see at church, we expect to see you there. And when you're missing, that is a problem. I see Joan, whenever I see Joan, I know, okay, we're all together. We're hang in there, Joan! And we see each other. And we see each other as examples because we're practicing the faith and we're part of that. And Zelda's the one that brought that up. I turned her and I said, do you realize you're also the furniture for other people? She's like, I hadn't really thought of that. But it's true, because we are. And that also is a calmness that says this is we're on the right direction. At least we know where we're at.
In any kind of practice, it's helpful to have a community practice, right? And it's helpful to have people who are doing the same things, and to have a community. And it's helpful to have people who are doing the same things, and to have a community. And it's helpful to have people who are doing the same things, and to have a community. And it's helpful to have people who are doing the same things, and to have a community. And it's helpful to have people who are doing the same things, and to have a community. And it's helpful to have people who are doing the same things, and to have a community. And it's helpful to have people who are doing the same things, and to have a community. And it's helpful to have people who are doing the same things, and to have a community. And it's helpful to have people who are doing the same things, and to have a community. And it's helpful to have people who are doing the same things, and to have a community. And it's helpful to have people who are doing the same things, and to have a community. And it's helpful to have people who are doing the same things, and to have a community. And it's helpful to have people who are doing the same things, and to have a community. And it's helpful to have people who are doing the same things,
I find particularly helpful to have people who are at different stages of the cycle. Right? If we were all in the cycle together, it might be a problem. Maybe we all push each other down and so on, but it almost never works that way. Right? When you fall in a way, there's somebody who's on the upswing who can help you out. And seeing those other people and reminding yourself that you're not alone can be a big part of living that. The other thing that I'll say about virtues in terms of the philosophy of virtue ethics is it's often very much community based, right? In the sense that this is something that we do together. And that's is really essential to what Lewis is talking about here, right? And the other thing that goes along with virtue ethics is precisely this notion of exemplars.
And sometimes
Those exemplars are saints, of course. But sometimes there's somebody who you know has gone through tough times, maybe even recently, and has managed to find a way through it. Right? They can give you a little courage to come back. Yeah. All right, great. Let's move on to this.
Well, ours was Instagram and said that faith and love both swings. They take effort. You pursue it. They grow stronger with attention. Attention and faith would be the prayers and readings in church, and so they continue to grow. And we didn't do this. How they're different. And then I guess on the
Or no, bargaining, faith.
Yes.
We decided faith was a gift, and that you don't bargain with God, because gifts are not.
Yeah, let me put the second part off until the next chapter, because that's where we're really going to take that up.
All right, there is it's well, always. So it's the next chapter. But right, so again, this table I think had the analogy of faith and love too. Right, these are things. Right, I mean these are the Christian virtues that come together: faith, hope, and love. Right, and things that you do, things that you practice, things that you do, not things that you have or that you don't have. Right? And part of the need to return is they can improve, they can also degenerate, right? If not nurtured, right, and not practiced in the right way. Okay, great. Let's move on to this table. Oh, sorry, the puck. Yes.
So we were talking about how Lewis's what was Lewis's position of faith, and I brought to the table, and we discussed a little bit that this way of viewing faith goes it's intimately connected with Paul's analogy of the shield of faith in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 13, when he is making an analogy of the armor of God, and the analogy is with the Roman soldier's armor. And it goes, it is related to Lewis's concept of faith, because in this sense, because shield, it's to deflect attacks, right, and support something with which you're going to attack next, a sword or whatever. And that's analogous with what Lewis is saying about, well, faith is not opposed to reason, rather faith supports what you already believe through reason. And we just thought that was a very good analogy.
Right. Yeah, it's a defense of what you believe. It's not a way of coming to believe. It's a defense of what you believe and a strengthening of what you believe against all the forces, all the attacks that are likely to pull you away from that, right? On analogy with, any of the Aristotelian virtues, right? Maybe take the Aristotelian virtue of continence, right? Say not drinking too much, right? To remind yourself right? To remind yourself of how you want to be sociable, but you don't want to feel awful the next day. You want to hurt other people and so on. Is a way of holding on to your belief that you ought to drink in moderation at the times when you're inclined either not to drink at all or to drink too much. Right? Aristotle thinks you should drink some, but not too much. Aristotle thinks, right? You agree, right? So, right, in the same way, there's all sorts of things that are going to pull us one way or the other, right? About those beliefs, and faith is supposed to protect us, supposed to give us a kind of steadiness, right? So the other thing that virtue ethics will often talk about, right, is the life lived as a kind of integrity, right? With a kind of identity, right? A kind of long-running sense of one's character. Not, there was a funny little doodle of the person being pushed about. I couldn't connect it with the words, but that in defending what you have come to believe, right, you're defending the integrity of your own character. Right? And in this sense, right, Lewis thinks that that goes for the atheist just as much as it goes for the Christian. Okay, let's go to this table.
So we had a good discussion. One of the things that came up was a term that I think we've all heard, and that's the idea of being saved. And it's a one and done that I'm saved. So I'm all done with it. And what happened with that? So we said that faith becomes more something that's not put directly in our heads, as you were talking about. It's that idea that we have to learn about it originally, have to come to a decision about it, have to learn more, have to develop it, and really strengthen it. And you can do it through many different ways, but that it isn't a one and done process. It's something that is always ongoing. And that community is probably one of the biggest things, like what we're doing, is one of the biggest things for helping us to figure out what we believe and work on that.
Right. Yeah, it's I think it's in the next chapter. I don't think we've heard it, but yeah, Lewis has this nice line that arguing about whether it's faith or works that saves you is like arguing about which blade of the scissor is the most important. Right? And there is this sense, right? And both in the moral domain and in the domain of our belief, that it's something that you have to continually do and you have to continually practice. And the two sides to keep together, and this is really what we're going to talk about in the next chapter, the two sides to keep together are, there's some way of getting better, even though you're constantly falling back. And even though in God's eyes, it's not really the right way to think about it at all, but that you can't come to the right way of thinking about it until you explore it the wrong way, right? Quite a few times. And then we'll get to this sort of faith in the second sense. Yeah. All right, let's do these two more tables and we'll take a break.
So we, like everybody else, faith is a gift that's learned first, and you've got to come to it with a rational understanding. Otherwise, as Lewis said, you're stupid for believing something you can't rationalize. Must be continuously cultivated. But also we talked about faith, if your sole focus is faith, it can be destructive, like other sole focuses of health, and you mentioned several before. It's got to be a lived, continuously renewed process.
And destructive, like in the way we were talking about. You can have faith that something's going to happen or something you pray for, but if you don't work toward it, all the faith in the world is going to get you there. You know, yeah. I have faith that God's going to help me do this, but if you put no effort in it at all, is that really faith? Yeah.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of mistakes that he's trying to guard against when it comes to faith. And I think that that's one of them. It's, I think in this way too, another mistake he's trying to guard against when it comes to faith is, and this is stuff that we're not going to talk about, the different purpose of the book, is sort of similar to what he was talking about with morality, right? Morality thinks, like, you don't want to make the mistake of thinking it's entirely clear exactly what all the rules are. You also don't want to make the mistake of thinking there aren't any rules, nobody agrees on anything, right? Similarly, in the other parts where he's talking about mere Christianity, he says, look, you shouldn't be a mere Christian. You should be an Anglican or a Catholic or something like that. But you should also not think that those differences matter as much as the difference between whether you're a Christian or you're not a Christian. Right, so in a nice metaphor, he describes mere Christianity as the waiting, like a hall.
Mere Christianity
And
as the waiting.
there's doors
like
off the hall, which are all the Christian denominations. And you go in one of those doors, don't wait in the
And you should go in one of those doors.
Go through one of them. And think about it, it matters.
Think about it, it matters which one you go through.
But it more matters that you're in the house,
That you're in the house.
right, than you get there. And you don't want to be caught up, right, on thinking that the details of the doctrine matter more than your continued practice of them and your continued honest attempt to have them form you, I think is Lewis's. Right, anybody, Don Mitchell was up, some people know Don Mitchell. Don Mitchell was up at Daily Mass. Don Mitchell was a former colleague of mine, worked on Buddhism. Right, he said he would go to all of these Buddhist monasteries, and he would say, "I'm a Catholic," and he would say, "I want to talk about your theology," and they would say, "We don't want to talk about your theology. We want to know what you do. Right? What does the practice look like? What do you actually do when you're being religious?" Right, and Don can really appreciate that question. Right, that's going a lot further than where Lewis wants to go. Lewis does think the theoretical content of what we believe is important, but he also thinks we got a temptation to ignore the necessity for the kind of practices that we need to make those beliefs really matter to us. Right? And we have to focus more on that. Okay, this last table, and then we'll take a break.
We talked about a lot of things that have been discussed. I'm going to focus on our discussion on how we nurture our faith. And we were talking about the part of Lewis's book where you really don't know where you stand until you fight the German army, you know, and go through those battles. And we talked about how we nurture our faith through prayer, dialogue, seeking the presence of God. But we're doing it and conscious of it at times where we're struggling and we draw upon our humility and swallowing our pride. And then we have the sense of presence and grace because we're dealing with something very difficult and we feel elevated to that virtue. We had two examples. One was conflict resolution where you have one person, I'm right, second person, they're right. At some point, to really get anything valuable out of that, someone's got to swallow their pride and think of something higher. And if you don't do that, then those two, you know, litigants or combatants are on the way to someplace dark. And that happens every day. The second one was an example of this is when you have a sense of something tragic or bad happening to you, like an illness, and you seek your faith to nurture you and be restored to you, and you find yourself wanting to take the exam and saying, you know, I've been good enough, why is this happening to me? Or bargaining, and those are unsatisfying. But what moves us out of that, hopefully, is the same sort of humility to just try to live through that pain and struggle and feel the grace that comes at that moment.
Yeah. This leads right to what we're going to do in the next chapter, which I think is the hardest thing that we've done so far. It's really related to the stuff we were talking about with respect to hope, right? This sort of double vision that Lewis thinks that we have to have. right? To see the things on earth sort of through seeing them as not the things in heaven, or not as good as the things in heaven, but not losing sight of the things on earth either, right? To practice this kind of double vision and keep it in mind. And so, you know, in the case of the litigants, often, you know, when you have a conflict, the key to resolving that conflict is to hold in mind your sense of what is right about the conflict, while also being able to, and who's in the right and who's in the wrong and in what ways, and also being able to move beyond it to hoping for the best for the other side of that party, right? And trying to get to a resolution that everybody can live with. Okay. So we're going to talk about that a lot in the next chapter, which again, I think is the most difficult stuff that we've done so far. So let's take at least a 5-minute break, go get yourself some water, and so on, and then we will be back.
Yes.
It's not right. I never heard of that.
A juror can say, I don't care. That's why in the South, like lynching cases, all white juries acquit people. Until his jury acquitted or still. Yeah, because we don't care what the law says. It's a well, that's our country. It was designed that way.
All right. So this one will be a little bit different because there is no video for this bit. Yeah, right. And you don't want me drawn. It will be a big disappointment after everything that we just said. I think the thing to do is to just turn your loose on the questions. We only got about a half an hour anyway. But I'll give you more time to think about those, because you'll have to do some reading and look at the text and so on. So we are on chapter 12, right? Faith continued, and we're on to this second sense of faith. So some of the things that were coming up this last time will be relevant here, right? The sense of faith, not as belief, but as leaving it to God and trusting to God. Right. Okay, so maybe take 10 minutes. We'll do a little bit longer to work on there on chapter 12. And maybe particularly that first question. Maybe we'll try and limit this down because we've got less time. Let's work on this first question. When making an effort to live a moral life, why should a Christian leave it to God? And particularly paragraphs 5 and 6. Those are, in my version, that's page 146 and 147. So it might be worthwhile to just sort of read over 146 and 147 first, and then turn to talking about it. Try to get something up on the flip chart.
Room. Theology.
Philosophy. John Mitchell's in the philosophy.
What about Jim Davis?
Jim Davis. Don't know who that is.
I think he's in his new mission. I mean, he's not now, he's retired. Yeah, I know, he's retired, but I don't know why. He's written several books. Yeah, but I thought he
All
was.
right, Huck's there. Does that mean we're starting with you? Did we end with you?
We ended with me.
Okay, all right. I guess we'll start with you.
But it's fun to pass it around.
Yeah.
As a speaker, it's like, okay, I'm on.
Yeah, you're in. All right, we'll wait for Michelle to finish up here.
bankruptcy.
Yeah.
It's such a chilling word to Americans. It's so important.
That's right.
What we were talking about.
We got nothing.
Oh, yeah. You don't understand.
That's right.
Bless your heart.
Yeah.
You're bankrupt. Now you understand.
Yeah.
Now we're getting somewhere.
That's right. No, that's exactly right. Yeah. It's and it makes the hope different. Yeah. It makes the big difference. Oh, talking about me?
I didn't get
Okay.
All right. I think we're about ready. Sorry to have cut you off. It looked like there were a whole bunch of good conversations going on there. In the 15 minutes we have left, we really are going to have to do kind of a speed round here. So I'm just going to try and let every table have its say, and maybe I'll add a little bit of something, and then I'll wrap up a little bit at the end, and then we'll head out. All right. So we're starting over here.
All right, so what did we understand leaving it to God really means? And first of all, it's recognizing our bankruptcy. And we love that word because it's so chilling to Americans. So, but it's the right word because no matter what you've done, bless your hearts, golf clap. It's nothing. Now we really get things started. Once you recognize your bankruptcy, and then at that point, that doesn't mean you give up. And obedience to God, and using our free will in the service of God is the idea. That's what leading it to God in the right way, in the way that brings about the virtue of faith.
Yeah, the bankruptcy reminds me of we were talking about, like, God's got all the chips. You got nothing to bet with. You got nothing to bargain with. And the two sides of this. So I mean, right on 146 in that first paragraph, I love the philosopher's love on the one hand, on the other hand, right? He's got this great line where he says, thus, in one sense, the road back to God is a road of moral effort, of trying harder and harder. But in another sense, it's not trying that is ever going to bring us home. All this trying leads up to the vital moment in which you turn to God and say, you must do this, I can't. Right? But you don't get there without the trying. And the trying doesn't do anything until you get there. Right? So it's holding both of those at the same time that's so difficult. Right? And he thinks it's this second sense of faith, right? This really hard thing that you have to practice, right? That makes it a virtue. Okay, move on to the next thing.
Living as God does not mean abdication of responsibility.
Exactly.
It means, exactly what you just said. It means letting God guide you in the path that you know in your heart is correct, and getting out of your own way to get there.
Right. And you continue to do it, even though you know it's
insufficient, even though you know that you'll
insufficient,
fail at it,
even though you know that
knowing
you
that
fail
it's
at
the
it,
path,
but knowing that it's the path,
knowing that
right? Knowing that
God's
God's
going
going to do it for you, or
God's
God's going to do it with you. Right? I mean, so much of this reminds me of this great line about art from the Irish writer Samuel Beckett. You know Samuel Beckett, Waiting for Godot and so on, right? He has this famous statement about art. He says, "To be an artist is to fail as no other dare fail. That failure is his vocation, and to shrink from it is desertion. Try again, fail better." Right? It's a similar, right? You're not off the hook once you recognize that you can't do it, right? It just throws you into the arms of God, into that kind of leaving it to God, trusting God. Great. All right, let's move on to this table.
Well, we had a lot of discussion, but what we just really loved the last few sentences in paragraph 6, that basically handing yourself over to God, really, you're still obeying him, you're still practicing your faith by handing yourself over. And that God's saving you now. He's saving you even before that point, really. And just love this last line, not hoping to get to heaven as a reward for your actions, but inevitably wanting to act in a certain way because the first faint gleam of heaven is already inside you. It's like it's already there. So if you don't ask, you're not going to get anything, basically.
Yeah, and not a bargain, but a response to something that's already been given to you.
Yes.
Right? Right. Not an attempt to gain salvation, but an attempt to respond to being saved. Yeah. Great. Let's do the next table.
So we were actually read that quote too. Yeah, no, because it's so beautiful. Yeah, and we were discussing the so how Lewis is telling us that good deeds, we cannot do good deeds or live a moral life in order to attain salvation, but rather that our moral lives should be a consequence of having that little piece of heaven inside of us. And at that point is where faith comes to play. It's our response to that salvation in conjunction with our actions that will make us actually get closer to heaven.
Yeah, there's this nice line right above these passages you were talking about where he says something like, you keep trying, you just worry less about it, right? Trying in a new way, a less worried way, right? A way that is less indexed to the immediate failures that you're running into, right? That sees this in a wider frame, in a wider perspective, right? This, again, this kind of double vision to, on the one hand, not have the false view that you're morally a terrific success, but on the other hand, not having the view that your trying has done nothing, right? It has done something. It's just done not what you might have thought. It's responded to a gift rather than achieved a goal, right? And thinking about it that way changes it entirely. Yeah. All right, let's go to this table.
So, three main points that'll be very quick. The first one is you're driving down the road of life and something keeps getting thrown in your way and you're challenged, and all of a sudden that great country song comes to your mind by Carrie Underwood, Jesus Take the Wheel. Why don't we actually talk about it, right? Okay, and that leads to, because trust in Christ, that's our second point. And then the third one, we go to St. Augustine, which is pray as though everything depended on God and work as though everything depended on you. So we think that those three summarize the whole lead to God.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. The focus on God and the work on you, right? The sense to let God be in control, but that doesn't mean you slide into the passenger seat and do nothing, as it were, right? That you continue to work, and it's just now that God works through you. Yeah, great. Let's go to this table.
I'm not sure our table had any more insights than those that have already been spoken. One thing that I will say is that in the story of the prodigal son, the prodigal son had to throw down the husks that were in his hands and say, I'm done with this. Even the servants in my father's house eat better than this. And give up his pride and go back to his father's house and beg forgiveness. And when that happened, he got the gift of forgiveness and was overwhelmed by the generosity of his father. So that there was a dialogue there of a kind, and his father saw him coming from a long way off. So his father knew what he was about. And so that it's not that this happened in isolation. It happened because the son was willing to recognize that he had failed.
Yeah.
And that was part of it.
There's a nice line. I don't think it's in the chapters that we're talking. It's another chapter where Lewis says something like, in the presence of God, in the authentic presence of God, you got basically two choices. Think of yourself as an awful, I think he says, slimy creature, or don't think of yourself very much at all and just try to do the right thing. And the second option is better than the first, right? But those are both sort of responses to failure in this way, right? I mean, you can think of yourself as a failure, right? Or you can think of yourself who is still trying to respond to God, right? And that if you can think of yourself in the second way, right, that allows you to keep going and allows you to keep working and doing good with less worry. Right? Yeah. All right, let's go to this table.
Okay. So humility plus surrender is the path to God. And that comes from, you have to let go of the pride. And you get to the end of the road where you've done everything you can, but you can't do anything more. All you can do is leave it to God. Without leaving it to God, surrender is quit. I mean, there's nowhere to go, right? So you need to leave it to God to carry on.
Yeah.
And doing something good will come out of tragedy. We're going to wrestle with this whole thing about, tragic events and stuff. God has purpose that we may never see or understand.
Yeah, I mean, so this is the other, we've sort of been focusing on the way we leave it to God and trust in God to love us despite our failures and so on, right? But there's this whole other side of the picture we haven't really talked about today at all, which is the big plan, capital B, capital P, right? In which all of this is embedded in the wider significance of what's going on, right? There is a kind of humility here that Lewis is counseling us to have in both of these ways, right? To have humility about our moral achievements, but also to have humility about our understanding of the world, right? And the fuller consequences of what's going on. All right, we'll finish up with this table.
Okay, so we're table 8, and it's really cool, and I thought we had a great discussion. But just going down my list, I have to check off like nearly everything that everyone else brought it up.
But I do have one thing I think hasn't been addressed. One of us mentioned that as humans, we live a linear life. We live in the present moment. We have our past and then our future, but there are times in the present where things just go off the rails, right? And it's really easy for us to say blame other people. Something horrible like we get fired or something like that, in a flood. Maybe even blame God for this misfortune. But faith is recognizing this is not going to be a big deal in the end. Does having no cash, is that really going to keep you out of heaven? Does having to start over in some aspect of your life, is that going to separate you from God's thinking about things that happened in the past, our sins. All right, realistically, we go to confession and we'll say, I'm not going to sin anymore, but we have to be back because that's the thing that we just can't control. We're going to be sinning as long as we breathe. But God's going to help us get through this, make us better people in dealing with this human world.
Yeah, there's something about having that perspective, right? That eternal perspective and the perspective off in the distance, right? I mean, we were just joking about mountain biking, but a common mistake that beginner mountain bikers make is they look right in front of a tile, right? Well, you're going to hit whatever is right in front of your tire no matter what you do.
Yeah.
What you really need to be doing is looking up the trail. And you'd be surprised how much better you get at navigating a trail if you're looking further on, where you could actually do something about that. So much in our everyday lives is just going to happen. Right. And it's a matter of keeping that perspective. Again, this kind of like double vision that Lewis wants us to have, right? To value the present, to value earth, but only because of that like glimpse of heaven, that glimpse of salvation that's in it, right? That'll keep us sort of oriented in the right direction. Okay, hey, look, this was fantastic. I really want to thank everybody for coming and spending the whole day talking about this. I really appreciate it. There were more thoughts than we really could have gotten into, and we skipped a whole chapter. So thank you for coming. Thank you for your engagement. Thanks for sharing all your ideas and so on. I've got a few things, right? Think about what this means to you. The rest of the book is fantastic. Really, really good. If you haven't seen any, there's copies upstairs. Vince is going to send out an email to you that I have an evaluation. Help the Men of St. Thomas plan further things that you thought went well, things that you didn't think went so well. And in that email is going to have links to all of the YouTube videos that we were showing, in case you want to look at that. And for the men among you, consider Men of St. Thomas. Yeah, Tammy.
So first of all, Vince.
Yeah, absolutely. That's fantastic. Yeah. Thanks.
I think we need to recognize Arthur
For the food. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, the next thing we get for most is Mother's Day brunch. Day on Mother's Day. Circle your calendar. We've got a lot of plans to do before that. We'll be in this room. And as before, we'll throw your socks off. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a good Saturday. Check out Chris. Hey, thanks. Yes. Good choice. Yeah.